She was abandoned in the street to be eaten by dogs. But 3 days later, her body became the foundation of one of Rome's oldest temples. This is not merely a story of martyrdom. It is the account of a young woman who lost everything at the Roman Empire's most dangerous crossroad, but who discovered a strength more potent than imperial power itself. We are in the pulsing heart of Rome, in the mid-4th century, a time of opulence and shadows, where the cold marble of the Forum and the echoes of sandals on basalt pavements concealed a growing, deadly tension. The vast libraries and public baths still bustled with life, but the air smelled of incense and fear. The empire had just emerged from the era of Constantine the Great, who had legalized Christianity. For decades, the new faith flourished, elevating Christian families to positions of prominence. But this peace was fragile, and in 361, the pendulum of history swung violently backward. A notorious emperor ascended the throne, famous for his intelligence, his neo-pagan fervor, and his hatred of Christianity. Flavius Claudius Julianus, better known to history as Julian the Apostate. Julian was not a persecutor in the mold of Nero or Diocletian. He was more subtle and, to many, more dangerous. His goal was not just to kill Christians, but to erase their memory, demoralize them, and most importantly, force them to renounce their faith, restoring the ancient splendor of the Roman gods. This was the arena where Bibiana's family would be forced to fight. The young Bibiana, whose name carries the sound of life, Viviana, was not a commoner hiding in the catacombs. She was born at the height of Christian Roman society. Her father, Flavian, was a man of prestige and influence, having served as prefect of Rome. Think of the power, the dignity, the expensive robes, and the responsibilities that came with such a title. Her mother, Dafrosa, was known for her discretion and unshakable devotion. Bibiana and her sister Demetria grew up in a home where Christian piety mingled with the elegance of patrician Roman life. They had access to everything: the fine silk that brushed their skin, the scent of myrrh and expensive oils, the cool, silent courtyards that contrasted with the suffocating heat and noise of external Rome. This was a world of comfort and security, based on the belief that the era of persecution had ended forever. But in 362, with Julian's ascent, the shadow of death once again stretched long over the eternal city. Imperial edicts arrived like cold, calculated death sentences. The persecution aimed to dismantle Christian leadership, and Flavian, an openly Christian former prefect, became a prime target. The fall of this noble family was brutal and swift. Flavian's arrest must have been a public and humiliating event. Imagine the scene: the massive doors of the house, once a symbol of power, being battered open by imperial guards, the smell of metal and the soldiers' sweat invading the once perfumed rooms. Bibiana, perhaps barely 20 years old, watched in horror as her father, the pillar of her world, was dragged away. Flavian was subjected to agonizing torture to force him to deny Christ. He resisted. As punishment and example, he was exiled, a slow death sentence, to a desolate place called Ad Aquas Silvanus. The journey was long, arduous, under the relentless Roman sun. Flavian, weakened and injured, did not survive the trip or the ill treatment. He died, becoming the family's first martyr. For Dafrosa, the mother, mourning was not permitted. Governor Apronianus, the executor of Julian's orders in Rome, was a ruthless man, determined to break the morale of the Christians. He saw in Dafrosa an opportunity to break the resistance of her daughters. Shortly after her husband's death, Dafrosa was arrested and beheaded. The Roman sword was swift, but the act was a spectacle of terror, meant to freeze the blood of anyone who dared defy the empire. Suddenly, Bibiana and Demetria found themselves helpless. Not only had they lost their father and mother in quick succession, but the dignity and security that the Flavian name represented was swept away. Their assets were confiscated, the silk clothes, the jewels, the lands. In the blink of an eye, they were orphans, stripped bare, and worse, marked. Apronianus opted for a different tactic with the two young women. Instead of a quick execution, he subjected them to severe house arrest. It was not a stone dungeon, but a psychological cage. The goal was simple: starvation, deprivation, and isolation. He left them to languish, hoping that physical pain and hopelessness would lead them to accept paganism and thus profane the memory of their parents. Days turned into weeks of oppressive silence. The smell of filth and deprivation replaced the perfume. Murmurs of prayer were the only thing that broke the heavy stillness. They fasted, but now the fasting was dictated by necessity and terror. The humanity behind the sanctity emerges here. The hunger was real, the fear was palpable. Bibiana must have looked at her sister Demetria and seen the weakness, the pale skin, and wondered, how much longer can we endure? The conflict reached its peak when Apronianus finally summoned them to his tribunal. The room was likely cold, the marble harshly reflecting the torchlight. The governor, wrapped in his official robes, seemed the epitome of earthly power, surrounded by imposing guards. He did not want martyrs. He wanted humiliating conversions. The proposition was simple and tempting. A single word, a gesture of renouncing the Messiah, and they would have their lives back. Perhaps not the wealth, but the security, the warmth, the possibility of a family. It was at this dramatic moment that an event occurred that shocked even Apronianus. Demetria, already weakened by hunger and ordeal, refused. She confessed her faith aloud, with the last strength remaining to her. And then, before the governor and the soldiers, she collapsed dead. Not by the blow of a sword, but exhausted, surrendered. An act that tradition considered a miracle of grace, the body succumbing at the exact moment of confession, sparing her the torture that would have followed. Bibiana was alone. She had lost her father, mother, and now her only companion in misery. The pain of loss was immeasurable, but the resolve that seized her was even greater. She was now the last pillar of that noble house. She was the final target of Julian the Apostate and his cruel representative, Apronianus. But the governor was not yet finished. He realized that direct physical violence strengthened faith. He needed to attack chastity and honor. And so, he handed the virgin Bibiana over to a woman named Rufina. The goal was no longer death, but corruption. The plan was to force her into a pagan marriage, profaning her purity and her faith, destroying her morally before destroying her physically. It was a trap that demanded not only courage, but constant spiritual vigilance against subtle temptation. Saint Bibiana's struggle from this point on would become a vivid testimony to perseverance amidst the most intimate and destructive pressure. The stage was set for the final act of a resistance that would echo for 16 centuries. The warm air of 4th century Rome carried not only the smell of cheap incense mixed with the acridity of sewage and the strong odor of the crowd's sweat in the forum. For those who knew how to listen, there was also the subtle but growing scent of fear. It was the year 361 AD. A few decades earlier, the great Emperor Constantine had conferred legitimacy upon Christianity, but the peace was fragile, superficial, and now threatened by a new sovereign, Julian, a man determined to erase the sign of the cross and restore the glory of the pagan gods. He would go down in history as Julian the Apostate. In this scenario of seismic change, where the Christian faith was once again an act of political treason, lived a family whose devotion was as deep as their social prominence. We enter the home of Flavian, a man of prestige, whose career had led him to the crucial post of prefect of Rome. Think of the role of the prefect. He was the city's highest authority, responsible for order, finance, and the administration of justice. He was part of the establishment, a pillar of the empire. Beside Flavian was his wife Daphrosa, a Roman matron who radiated a serenity that contrasted with the political turbulence of the time. This was not a home of hesitant new converts. This was a house of established faith, where the teachings of Christ were the foundation, even if the front door required the performance of the complex and dangerous etiquette of pagan Rome. In truth, the home of Flavian and Demetria was a small lighthouse, perhaps a bunker of Christian life, in a city that, at any moment, could turn against those who followed the symbolic fish rather than the legionary eagles. Flavian and Demetria had two daughters, Demetria and Bibiana. It is on the figure of Bibiana, whose name means "she who lives," that our story focuses. Born around the mid-4th century, Bibiana grew up with the privilege of nobility. Let us imagine the setting of her childhood: the cold marble floor beneath her bare feet, the fine silk tunics that brushed against her skin, the muffled sound of servants, and the clinking of silver goblets at meals. She did not know material misery, but from an early age, she knew the spiritual poverty of needing to hide the most precious truth. Bibiana's childhood was not marked by the carefree play that money could buy, but rather by lessons learned in whispers. Roman education was rigorous, focusing on rhetoric, Latin, and philosophy, but home education, overseen by Demetria, included the catechism. The Gospels were not read openly. The scrolls were guarded zealously, taken out only in moments of deep privacy, perhaps late at night, illuminated by the flickering light of an oil lamp. Bibiana and Demetria learned to distinguish the difference between the empty pomp of pagan processions that paraded down the Via Sacra with their animal sacrifices and the smoke of burning fat, and the austere, dangerous simplicity of the Mass secretly celebrated in some damp, dark catacomb. This duality of a young Christian woman's life in 4th century Rome was an immense pressure. In public, one had to bow. In private, one had to pray. We can imagine Bibiana, still a child, sitting at her mother's feet, Demetria, with her calm voice, narrating the stories of the apostles, of Paul, of Peter, and of the early martyrs who gave their lives for the faith. They were not just stories of heroism, they were preparations. They were lessons about the only wealth that could not be confiscated, the soul. Bibiana's first signs of faith, therefore, were not spectacular miracles or visions. They were silent acts of obedience and perseverance. They were the courage to reject toys or rituals associated with the old gods, the discipline of small fasts for a child, the concentration in prayer in a noisy pagan world. It was the growing decision that faith was not just a family tradition, but a personal choice made under the constant shadow of risk. Their father, Flavian, carried the greatest burden. As a former prefect, he was a high-profile public figure. He had been loyal to Rome, but his loyalty to Christ was greater. While Constantine and his Christian successors ruled, this dual loyalty was manageable. But with Julian's rise in 361, the line between citizenship and heresy evaporated. Julian did not explicitly prohibit Christianity, but he used insidious methods to stifle it, banning Christian teachers from schools, exclusively favoring pagan officials, and requiring all public servants to actively participate in the rituals of the ancient gods. The pressure on Flavian must have been unbearable. If he yielded to the emperor's orders, he would ensure his family's safety, keep his properties, and his prestige. He would only have to burn a little incense to Jupiter or participate in a banquet dedicated to Venus. No one in Roman society would blame him. On the contrary, they would consider him sensible. It was the path of convenience, the path that many Christians unfortunately chose. But Flavian did not yield. His decision, made in some dark moment in his library, with the scent of olive oil and ancient dust in the air, was the first crack in the family's wall of security. He chose integrity. He chose faith. This choice, which seemed an act of stubbornness to the world, was the first and most crucial lesson in martyrdom that Bibiana and Demetria received. They saw their father, a man of power and status, voluntarily strip himself of everything for the sake of a truth he could not deny. The atmosphere in the house changed drastically. Visits became rare, whispers became louder. The danger was no longer in the streets, but knocking directly at the door. The joy of childhood was replaced by a forced seriousness. Bibiana and Demetria, who were perhaps only 15 and 16 years old at the time, had to mature quickly, absorbing their parents' tension and anxiety as they watched their faith transition from the theoretical plane to brutal reality. Flavian lost his position. His wealth began to be confiscated. The life of luxury gave way to uncertainty. The family, once powerful, was now under constant surveillance. This environment of imminent deprivation and political ostracism, instead of destroying the girls' faith, cemented it. They saw in their parents not the weakness of those who lose, but the strength of those who choose to gain eternity. This is the context in which Bibiana's journey begins. She is no longer just the prefect's daughter. She is a young Roman woman who, under the guidance of her parents, learned that being Christian fundamentally means being willing to lose everything. And Emperor Julian the Apostate was not willing to tolerate this silent, stubborn form of resistance. He needed examples of surrender. He was about to make an example of Flavian and his family. And so, the path to martyrdom was sealed, starting with the arrest and exile of the first pillar of the family's faith, the father, Flavian. Fear was now entrenched, and Bibiana would have to confront it alone. The whirlwind of ancient Rome in the 4th century was not a stage of immutable marble and glory, but rather a cauldron of violent transitions. It was a city where the promise of a new, theoretically Christian empire since Constantine clashed daily with the suffocating weight of 1,000 years of pagan traditions. The air over the Palatine was heavy, mixing the acrid smell of rancid olive oil and the soot from the bonfires with the sweet, sickening perfume of incense burned to the ancient gods in revived rituals. In this vibrant but deeply dangerous scenario grew Bibiana, or Viviana, as her name was sometimes recorded. Her youth was not marked by the deprivations that became synonymous with Christian martyrdom. Bibiana was the daughter of the Roman elite, born into a house where material comfort and spiritual devotion walked side by side. Her father, Flavian, had ascended to the respectable and powerful position of prefect of Rome, a post that placed him at the heart of the imperial administration. Think of the prefect of Rome as the city's main caretaker, the man responsible for public order, supply, and the majesty of the world's capital. Her mother, Dafrosa, was known for her discretion and deep charity. It was a privileged home, with servants, fine linen robes, and access to the most exclusive forums and gardens. For Bibiana and her sister Demetria, faith in Christ was a tapestry woven into the luxury of Roman life. They did not grow up in dark catacombs, but in rooms bathed in sunlight, filtered through rich curtains, learning the scriptures from valuable scrolls. For most Romans of the time, Christians were no longer the marginal sect persecuted by Nero or Diocletian. They were part of the power structure. There was a false sense of security, the comfortable belief that the time of the great persecutions was over, that the cross had definitively triumphed over the pagan eagle. This peace, however, was precarious, dependent on the will of a single man sitting on the imperial throne. And in the year 361 AD, that man was Julian the Apostate. Julian was not a simple enemy. He was not the bloodthirsty executioner of the old guard. Julian was an intellectual, a philosopher, a nephew of Emperor Constantine, who, instead of embracing Christianity, repudiated it with almost messianic fervor. His goal was not merely to kill Christians, but to dismantle Christianity from its social and economic foundations. Julian sought to restore the lost glory of the Greco-Roman gods, and viewed Bibiana's faith as a disease that weakened the empire. For Bibiana's family, Julian's ascent was a seismic tremor. Overnight, the loyalty Flavian had to the empire was confronted by the loyalty he had to Christ. The emperor began to implement a subtle but brutal persecution. He forbade Christians from teaching in schools, imposed pagan sacrifices for anyone wishing to maintain a public office, and used economic force and social contempt to isolate the faithful. Flavian, the respected former prefect, became the perfect example. Julian needed to show that no one was safe, especially those who had infiltrated the high ranks. The pressure on Flavian must have been excruciating. Would he give up power, wealth, and his family's safety, or would he make the symbolic gesture of burning incense to the pagan gods, ensuring the continuity of his position? In the intimacy of the home, Flavian and Dafrosa's conversations with their young daughters, Bibiana and Demetria, changed drastically. The faith that was once celebrated in banquets and quiet prayers now became a burden, a palpable threat. The silence inside that noble house must have been deafening, broken only by the whispers of prayers and growing fear. What would happen when the imperial emissaries arrived? The sensory richness of 4th century Rome intensified the drama. The clothes Bibiana wore, the rings she used, the oriental perfumes Dafrosa enjoyed, all of this now seemed vanity in the face of imminent loss. Young Bibiana, accustomed to protection and social respect, watched her father's reputation being shattered in the forums, despite his years of loyal service. The sentence came quickly and ruthlessly. Flavian refused to yield. His renunciation of faith would have meant the acceptance of paganism as supreme. He chose integrity over political survival. The punishment that followed was the opposite of quick and heroic death. Flavian was stripped of his assets, publicly humiliated, and instead of being beheaded, he was exiled. The chosen destination, ad aquas Silvanus, was a place of misery and abandonment. The historian Eusebius recounts that exile was a form of slow, agonizing death. Flavian was not simply sent to the countryside. He was tortured before departure, subjected to ill treatment that transformed the long journey into a slow path of martyrdom. Bibiana, still a teenager, experienced the first blow of persecution, the public dishonor of her father, the pain of his departure, and the sudden, brutal economic penury. The strong man who was the foundation of her life disappeared, replaced by the cold, final news that he had succumbed to injuries and neglect in his exile, consecrating himself as a martyr of the faith. The tragedy did not stop there. Governor Apronianus, a man zealous in fulfilling Julian's orders, turned to Dafrosa. He saw her not just as the wife of the fallen prefect, but as the matriarch who kept the faith alive in her daughters. Apronianus's plan was simple: to break the family's morale. Dafrosa, confronted with the option of saving her daughters by denying Christ, stood firm. She knew that the true legacy she could leave Bibiana and Demetria was not the palaces or the confiscated wealth, but the unbreakable example. The scene of her execution must have been somber, a stark contrast to the brilliance of Roman social life. Dafrosa was summarily beheaded, a quick public execution designed to instill maximum terror in the remaining daughters. It is at this point that the journey of Bibiana, the noble young woman accustomed to comfort, truly begins. She and Demetria were stripped of everything: their martyred and absent father, their beheaded mother, and all their possessions confiscated. The house that was once a haven of privilege became house arrest. The change in smells was brutal. The perfume of incense and jasmine was replaced by the odor of confinement, dust, and hunger. The texture of their luxurious robes gave way to the rough fabric of imposed poverty. They were subjected not to immediate torture, but to a more insidious form of violence, deprivation. Apronianus believed that hunger, solitude, and constant threat would break the resolve of these young women accustomed to easy living. He hoped that the human instinct for survival, the fear of being abandoned in a society that now saw them as outcasts, would force them to submit and perhaps marry influential pagans. But faith, forged in the fire of loss, proved more resilient than the structure of the empire. Bibiana and Demetria did not spend their time lamenting the loss of their wealth. They fasted and prayed, transforming physical deprivation into an exercise of spiritual strength. Julian and Apronianus's hope was that feminine fragility, accentuated by youth and pain, would make them yield. However, the suffering of their parents had ignited a flame in Bibiana's heart, a fire that would prove indomitable and was about to lead her to her own terrible final confrontation. This was the beginning of the Saint of Perseverance. In 4th century Rome, life pulsated at an uneven rhythm, marked by the luxury of imperial banquets and the furtive whisper of new beliefs. It was a time of violent contrasts. If, on the one hand, the great baths and white marble temples testified to the perpetual glory of the ancient gods, on the other, in the dark catacombs and the silent houses of the patricians, the name of Christ was invoked with growing devotion. It is in this scenario of political fragility and spiritual fervor that we find Bibiana's family, a family that had reached the pinnacle of social success, only to discover that true glory resided in total renunciation. Bibiana, whose name carries the sound of life, Viviana, was not born into conditions of deprivation. Her home was noble. Her father, Flavian, had served the city exemplarily, holding the prestigious title of prefect of Rome. Her mother, Demetria, was the model of the Roman matron, combining the dignity of social position with the humility of the recently adopted faith. For Bibiana and her sister Demetria, childhood was permeated by the security of status and the soft aroma of burning olive oil in the lamps that illuminated the discreet images of a fish or a good shepherd, Christian symbols hidden on the walls of the house. They grew up learning that faith was more valuable than treasure, yet they lived in comfort, enjoying the soft textures of silk and the rich flavor of the food that Roman life provided to the elite. The divine call for Bibiana began not with thunder, but with the silence of a family choice. They had already opted for the gospel, and now the world demanded that they deny that decision. Peace was abruptly torn apart in 361 AD with Julian's ascent to the imperial throne. Known to history as Julian the Apostate, his reign was brief but exceptionally dangerous for Christians. Julian did not only seek bloodshed, he sought to annihilate the faith through humiliation and social exclusion. His goal was not to create martyrs, but to restore paganism as the only acceptable path for the empire. Suddenly Christians, many of them members of the high Roman administration like Flavian, became enemies of the state, traitors to tradition, and social outcasts. The risk hovered like a heavy, cold cloak over Bibiana's house, replacing habitual comfort with corrosive anxiety. The first blow came quickly and brutally, aiming at the family pillar, Flavian. He was confronted and, before Governor Apronianus, vehemently refused to sacrifice to the pagan gods. For a man who had dedicated his life to public service, the demand to betray his faith was the death of the soul. Apronianus, the executor of Julian's policy, could not tolerate such an affront. The smell of pagan incense, sweet and sickening, that Flavian refused to touch, sealed his fate. Soldiers burst into the house, and the dry sound of metal armor and the dragging of heavy sandals hammered fear into the hearts of Demetria, Bibiana, and Demetria. The farewell was quick, laden with unsaid tears and tremendous pride. Flavian, the former prefect, was stripped of his insignia and instead of immediate death was condemned to exile and torture in ad aquas Silvanus. This was Bibiana's first great renunciation, the loss of her father, not to illness but to deliberate cruelty. She saw her father's strength not in his physical resistance, but in his silent determination. A short time later, the news arrived. Flavian had succumbed to ill treatment, becoming the family's first martyr. Morning had barely set in, heavy and suffocating, when Governor Apronianus turned his attention to the mother, Dafrosa. Pagan belief dictated that the woman should follow the man's authority. Without Flavian, Apronianus hoped Dafrosa would be more pliable, more attached to wealth and life. He was wrong. Dafrosa showed a courage that was the antithesis of the fragility expected of a Roman matron. She had received the divine call through her husband's faith and was willing to seal it with her own blood. The scene of Dafrosa's martyrdom must have been public, a spectacle of terror meant to intimidate the daughters and the entire Christian community of Rome. The cold morning breath, the odor of dust and the crowd's sweat, and finally, the unsettling sound of the blade falling. Dafrosa was beheaded by Apronianus's direct order, becoming the second pillar to collapse. Bibiana and Demetria were left alone. The family's nobility was reduced to two young women, orphans, stripped of all protection. Apronianus acted immediately, confiscating all their possessions. The cold marble floor of their house, once a sign of wealth, now just seemed cold. Tapestries were taken, jewels and money, emptying the home of its warmth and financial security. This was the third and perhaps most painful practical renunciation, the renunciation of comfortable life, inheritance, and their very Roman social identity. Apronianus, with a perverse tactic, believed that hunger and deprivation would be more effective than the sword. He subjected them to rigorous house arrest, leaving them isolated, hoping that hungry stomachs would break the spirit that terror had failed to crack. Here, the divine call manifested itself not in ecstasy, but in discipline and perseverance. For Bibiana and Demetria, the once opulent house became a cloister of fasting and prayer. Time, previously spent on social activities or study, was now filled with silence. The discomfort of hunger and physical weakness became fuel for unshakable spiritual strength. The body weakened, but the soul strengthened. The contemporary challenge imposed when observing this scene is profound. In an era of excess and immediacy, these young women teach us that true resistance often lies in the ability to endure absence, to find abundance in scarcity. Bibiana and Demetria, alone against the power of the empire, made their final choice to renounce earthly subsistence in favor of a life of prayer. Faith had passed from a family inheritance to a personal, firm, and irrevocable choice, preparing them for the final sacrifices that would come. The year is 362 of the Common Era, and the opulent city of Rome, mother of empires and center of the known world, breathed a heavy air of uncertainty and terror. For a brief and cruel period, Emperor Julian, known to history as the apostate, had withdrawn imperial favor from the Christian faith, trying to turn the clock back to the ancient pagan gods. For families like Bibiana's, living in the center of this political and spiritual effervescence, faith was no longer a private devotion, but an announced death sentence. The family enjoyed an enviable social status. Their father, Flavian, had worn the heavy toga of prefect of Rome, a position of immense power and prestige. Their house was not just a home, but a reflection of high Roman society. The cold marbles in the atriums, the smell of expensive incense and olive oil burning in bronze lamps, the fine texture of the robes Bibiana and her sister Demetria wore. It was a life of comfort and security, grounded, however, in a subterranean and deep faith. They knew that this life was a loan, and payment was about to be collected. The moment of the break came with the violence and surprise typical of persecution. One morning, the solid wooden doors of the residence were broken down, not by thieves, but by the emissaries of Governor Apronianus. Flavian, recognized for his unshakable devotion to Christ, was the first target. The contrast was stark. The man who administered justice in the capital was now dragged away, stripped of his official insignias, forced into a summary judgment that offered no option but to deny the God he served. His refusal was firm, an echo of Christian dignity amidst pagan brutality. Flavian's punishment was not quick death, but the slow agony of exile to ad aquas Silvinas. Bibiana, then a young woman barely out of adolescence, felt the blow not just as the loss of a father, but as the collapse of the entire protective structure of her life. She remembered the rough texture of the tunic Flavian wore upon leaving, the sound of chains dragging on the cobblestone floor, and the deafening silence that remained in the house after he was gone. Flavian died shortly after, not by the sword, but by the hardships and ill treatment inflicted by the guards in exile, consecrating himself as the family's first martyr. The loss, which should have broken the matriarch Dephrosa's resolve, did exactly the opposite. Instead of hiding or feigning submission, Dephrosa, perhaps driven by an urge to preserve her husband's honor and her daughter's faith, presented herself to the authorities. Her confession was public, a direct challenge to Julian's decree. For Governor Apronianus, her execution was a necessary act of demonstrating force, a bloody warning to all of Rome's Christian elite. The dry sound of the blade, the quick sight of blood, was Bibiana's second trauma. In a matter of weeks, the sisters were turned into stripped orphans. This was the beginning of Bibiana's mission, to survive the storm and keep the flame lit. Apronianus, however, had a more subtle strategy for the young women. He did not immediately send them to the gallows. For the Roman world, death by martyrdom brought glory, surrender by weakness brought shame. He confiscated all their assets, jewels, coins, properties, and subjected them to rigorous house arrest. The house that once shone was now a cold, silent cage. The challenge that followed was not the scourging, but hunger and deprivation. Luxury was replaced by penury. Fine garments gave way to rough rags. Bibiana and Demetria felt the piercing pain of scarcity. The smell of fresh bread was replaced by the odor of mold and humidity on the walls. Their young bodies, accustomed to feasting, began to waste away. But this material deprivation opened space for a profound spiritual transformation. The sisters clung to the only thing Apronianus could not take, the gospel. Their days were a routine of fasting, prayer, and waiting. They shared the little they had, whispering psalms in the dark. Bibiana, the stronger of the two, felt the tremendous responsibility of caring for her sister and maintaining hope. Their humanity manifested in the fear that nested at the bottom of their empty stomachs, but their overcoming came in the repeated certainty that their parents were in glory. Apronianus, impatient with the prolonged resistance, summoned them to the tribunal. The room was vast and intimidating, filled with officials and soldiers, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and authority. The governor, seated on his throne, observed the two young women, thin and pale, but surprisingly calm. He offered them the easy way out: deny Christ, marry pagan men, recover their inheritance and their lives. It was Demetria, the more fragile sister and perhaps more sensitive to physical suffering, who answered first. Her words were a faint thread, but charged with conviction. She confessed her faith aloud, declaring her love and loyalty to Christ. And then, in a moment of drama that froze the court, Demetria collapsed. It was not the blade or the whip that took her, but, according to accounts, the very intensity of her surrender. She expired right there, at the governor's feet, a final act of consecration that those present pagans and Christians considered a miracle or a divine omen. Demetria's sudden death was the final blow of isolation for Bibiana. She was now alone, the last of a noble lineage, facing the machine of Roman terror. Apronianus' strategy had failed to break the family's faith, but it had reduced it to a single young woman in deep mourning, hungry and exhausted. This was the turning point. Bibiana's challenge ceased to be shared physical deprivation and became a solitary test of chastity and moral perseverance. Apronianus, seeing that hunger did not work, decided that corruption would be the next step, handing Bibiana over to the custody of the matron Rufina, whose goal was to break the young woman's spirit and force her into a pagan marriage. But Bibiana's soul, forged in pain and tempered by the martyrdom of her loved ones, had just begun its true journey of resistance. The silence that fell upon Rome was heavier than the weight of chains. It was not the silence of peace, but the void left by the broken cry of a family. Bibiana, whose name meant she who lives, now found herself the sole survivor. Her father, Flavian, had died in exile, victim of the icy road and the scourges. Her mother, Dafrosa, had fallen under the axe in the very city her husband had once governed. And in a lapse of seconds that seemed to have torn the very fabric of time, her sister Demetria had collapsed after confessing the name of Christ, spared from torture, but leaving Bibiana terribly alone. Governor Apronianus, a cold and calculating man, understood that pure physical violence had failed. Spilled blood only fertilized the seed of faith. He then decided to change tactics, abandoning the scourging and fire in favor of a more dangerous weapon: temptation and corruption. Bibiana was not thrown into a damp dungeon. Instead, she was transferred to a more subtle and insidious prison. She was entrusted to the care of a Roman matron named Rufina, a woman of refinement, whose weapons were the seductions of life, comfort, and the promise of a future. The contrast was shocking. Bibiana, dressed in rags, still impregnated with the smell of fasting and deprivation, was dragged into a house that pulsed with the decadent luxury of 4th century Rome. There was no stench of sewage and death from house arrest, but rather the sickly sweet aroma of perfumed oils, expensive incense, and the soft noise of harps and futile conversations. The floor was not cold stone, but colored mosaics, heated by distant braziers. This was Bibiana's dark night of the soul, where the devil did not come as a monster, but as a smiling benefactor. Rufina, with her silk robes and discreet jewels, approached the young woman with feigned maternity. She saw her as a precious relic that needed to be polished and redirected. Rufina's mission, given by Apronianus, was simple: to break Bibiana's will, not with pain, but with the prospect of pleasure, forcing her into a pagan marriage that would seal her apostasy. "My sweet Bibiana," Rufina whispered as she offered her dates and spiced wine. "Why this childish stubbornness? You are young, beautiful, descended from one of the noblest families in Rome. Look at yourself. Your skin is pale, your eyes hollow from hunger. Your parents chose their path and they paid the price, but life still awaits you. There are suitors willing to forget this Christian madness if you only make a small concession." Bibiana, thin and fragile, sat in a corner, feeling the warmth and comfort she had not experienced for months. This was the most difficult moment. It was not the fear of pain, but the fear of being the one to fail. The ghosts of her family watched her. Would she be responsible for extinguishing the flame they had ignited with their own blood? Temptation attacked in waves. Solitude was the worst of them. Bibiana longed for a touch, a kind word that was not loaded with poisonous intent. The flesh cried out for plentiful food, for sleeping on something softer than the cold floor. Rufina used vanity, placing fine purple linen robes before her, polished bronze mirrors, suggesting the image of a normal life, recovered status, security. The psychological pressure was relentless. Rufina, upon realizing that Bibiana remained firm in refusing banquets and flirtations, intensified the moral harassment. She began to ridicule her faith, calling it a superstition of slaves, exposing the young woman's deepest fears. "Your sister died of fear, child. Your God has abandoned you. You are here, hungry, stripped bare, while Julian reigns and the empire prospers. Accept reality. The only divinity that will save you is the one you serve now, the Emperor, just a small sacrifice at the temple." In this golden captivity, Bibiana's struggle was purely internal. She had to fight the voice of human reason that screamed, "You have done enough." She had lost everything, endured hunger. She had the right to yield to survive. Many in Rome were doing exactly that, burning a grain of incense to Jupiter or Mithras to keep their heads down and their lives safe. But for Bibiana, yielding was to betray not only her faith, but the supreme sacrifice of her parents. Every night, while the opulence of Rufina's house surrounded her, Bibiana immersed herself in prayer. Her knees brushed the cold marble floor, the only place where she could feel a connection to the harshness of her former life. There, she asked not for liberation from the situation, but for the strength not to succumb to the promise of ease. After weeks of fruitless efforts, Rufina reached the limit of her patience. She tried the last and vilest card, the threat of sexual violence and dishonor, hoping that the fear of social and physical ruin would break Bibiana's vow of chastity. The matron tried to force Bibiana to interact with men of ill repute at night banquets. However, divine grace seemed to wrap the young woman like an invisible cloak. Faced with every attack, every attempt at dishonor, Bibiana remained immune. Her presence, exhausted and hungry, but unshakable in her purity of heart, seemed to repel malice. It was as if the inner light of her soul was so intense that it burned away the sinful intention around her. Furious at having failed in her mission to corrupt the young woman, and fearing Apronianus's wrath for the failure, Rufina finally reported that the Christian was unyielding, hardened by her superstition. The news made the governor's anger explode. Apronianus realized that he had lost the psychological game. There was nothing left to do but resort to the method he had tried to avoid, cruel and public martyrdom. For Apronianus, Bibiana's persistence was a personal insult to his authority, an affront that needed to be washed away with the young woman's blood. He ordered her to be brought back to the city center, not for a tribunal, but for a place of summary executions. Bibiana, upon hearing the death sentence, to be tied to a column and scourged with lead-tipped whips until death, felt a paradoxical relief. The end of the dark night had arrived. The weight of solitude, subtle temptation, and the pressure to conform was finally replaced by the clear certainty of sacrifice. She would not have to pretend or negotiate anymore. Only one last act of unconditional love remained. On the morning of December 2nd, 363, the 18-year-old girl walked barefoot on the Roman cobblestone, her fragile body about to face the fury of a decadent empire. The smell of Rome, of filth, spices, and dread filled the air. Her martyrdom was about to begin, but her soul, long freed from Rufina's temptation, was already flying home. What remained of Bibiana after the sudden death of her sister Demetria was not a girl cornered by pain, but rather the chrysalis of faith that finally opened. In the eyes of Governor Apronianus, she was the last piece to be bent, a young orphan stripped of status and wealth, isolated within the cold walls of her own confiscated house. But what Apronianus did not understand is that total loss of father, mother, sister, and possessions had wrought an alchemy in Bibiana's soul. This was the true spiritual maturity of a martyr, recognizing that the price of fidelity had already been paid by those she loved, and that her own life was now a mere epilogue to be lived only to honor their sacrifice. The solitude within that Roman home, once vibrant and welcoming, transformed into her cloister. The forced silence after the brutality of torture and decapitations was not empty, but full of the memory of her mother Defrosa, beheaded without flinching, full of the silent strength of Flavian, slowly dying in humid exile. Bibiana had no more worldly distractions. Her main work at this stage was not a public act, but an internal labor of forging her own soul in the crucible of trial. She fasted, not because she was forced, but because the world's food seemed tasteless before the Eucharist of pain she embraced. Prayer became her only dialogue, and the ancient walls, vestiges of a broken family glory, absorbed the constant murmuring of psalms in Latin. Apronianus realized that hunger and physical terror had failed. Bibiana did not fear death, but embraced it as a reunion. Changing tactics, he sought the most effective weapon against youth, temptation, and moral corruption. Bibiana's integrity, her consecrated virginity, was her last and most valuable treasure. If she could be dishonored and led into a pagan marriage, her testimony would be permanently stained, and Julian's victory over Christianity would be complete without the need for more blood. It was at this point that Apronianus introduced the figure of Rufina. Rufina, described in the Acts as a woman of ill repute and dissolute customs, represented the antithesis of everything Bibiana's family had taught. The young martyr was torn from the somber dignity of her home and entrusted to Rufina's custody in a calculated effort to undermine her resolve through easy comfort and immoral persuasion. The change was a sensory and spiritual shock. Bibiana, accustomed to the smell of dust and the austere simplicity of house arrest, was subjected to the strong, sweet odors of Roman hedonism, cheap perfumes, heavy oils, the smell of wine and rich dinners that contrasted with her fasting. Rufina did not use chains. She used decadent luxury as a trap. She tried to seduce Bibiana with the promise of life, of pleasure, of return to society, provided she merely offered a small sacrifice to the pagan gods. What unfolded was a silent and dramatic battle, a duel of wills within Rufina's opulent chambers. Bibiana, dressed in humble rags that contrasted with the silks and jewels offered to her, responded to every temptation with the shield of prayer and the sword of the gospel. It was not just a struggle for physical chastity, but for the integrity of her parents' memory. To yield would be to deny them. This resistance, day after day, facing not physical pain, but psychological corrosion, was Bibiana's second great work. She proved that true maturity does not bend either to terror or to comfort. Seeing that appeals to vanity, the fear of solitude, and the promise of a comfortable life failed miserably, Rufina, frustrated, had to report her failure to Apronianus. Bibiana, she said, was harder than marble. Apronianus's fury was now a mixture of political frustration and personal humiliation. How could a thin, solitary young woman defy the authority of the empire and the cunning of its agents? Persecution reverted to its most primitive and brutal method, pure violence. Bibiana's third and final work was her martyrdom. She was led to the forum, or a public place nearby, where the people could witness the power of the state. There, Apronianus ordered her to be tied to a column, a strong pillar, cold to the touch, which would paradoxically become the support of her eternal glory. The instrument of her martyrdom was not swords or fire, but whips laden with small pieces of lead, instruments designed to maximize pain and lacerate the flesh. In this culminating moment, Bibiana showed no doubt or weakness. Her maturity had prepared her. She faced death not as punishment, but as the consummation of her baptism, the final prize after the journey of mourning and temptation. The whips hissed in the air, and every blow that struck her back was accompanied by the hollow sound of lead, followed by acute pain. It is crucial to note that the text of the Acts records no laments or pleas for help from Bibiana. Her body was being destroyed, but her silence was a confession more powerful than any sermon. This heroic silence, this refusal to utter a single word of denial to Christ under the most excruciating torture, is the final proof that her soul was fully matured. She died there, tied to the column, her spirit departing while her body still hung, bloodied. The emperor, in his pettiness and hatred of Christian worship, ordered the body to be abandoned to the mercy of dogs, a Roman practice intended to erase any possibility of veneration of relics and deny the martyr the dignity of burial. But it is here that the reality of faith and the supernatural meet to seal Bibiana's sanctity. The dogs, animals known for their predatory instinct and ferocity toward human remains, hesitated. The young woman's body, thrown to the elements, remained untouched, surrounded by an inexplicable stillness. This is Bibiana's last miracle in life. Albeit posthumous, wild nature bows before absolute purity. Under the darkness of the Roman night, while the patrols dispersed and the city slept, a devout priest named John bravely approached the spot. He collected Bibiana's body, defying imperial law and risking his own life. John honorably buried Bibiana alongside her parents and sister near the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, a simple act of piety that ensured the continuity of her memory. Saint Bibiana's final work is her enduring legacy. Her sacrifice was not in vain. In 363, Julian died in battle and the persecution ceased. Quickly, the place where Bibiana suffered and was buried became a focus of intense devotion. In the 5th century, a church, Titulus Bibianae, was erected there, the Basilica of Santa Bibiana, over the very column of her martyrdom. That column, still visible today, is not just a historical relic, but a tangible symbol of her resistance. Over the centuries, devotion to Bibiana consolidated, especially in Rome. She is invoked, notably against epilepsy and mental illnesses, a popular recognition that if she resisted the total disintegration of family life and the most brutal psychological pressure, her intercession must be powerful against the afflictions that fragment the mind and spirit. For the contemporary public, Saint Bibiana's journey offers an invaluable lesson. In an era of growing anxiety and overwhelming social pressure, she remains the saint of perseverance. Her story reminds us that true strength resides not in aggression, but in the silent capacity to maintain integrity, to resist the temptations of easy compromise, and to keep the flame of faith burning, even when one is alone and the whole world conspires to bring us down. Bibiana, the girl who lost everything, gained immortality by refusing to lose herself. Her final maturity was total surrender, transforming the column of her torture into the pillar of her glory. The air in Rome in the year 362 no longer smelled of incense and parties, but of fear and cold metal. After the brutal execution of her mother Dephrosa outside the city walls and the painful death of her father Flavian in exile, the young Bibiana and Demetria found themselves alone. The persecution unleashed by Julian the Apostate, who sought to revive the ancient pagan cults, aimed not just at death, but at humiliation and economic ruin. Apronianus, the governor who supervised the cruelty in the name of the empire, confiscated all the family's assets. The sisters' initial punishment was not the whip, but slow deprivation. They were subjected to rigorous house arrest, confined to the house that was once the opulent home of a prefect. Imagine the brutal contrast: the polished marble walls, the frescoes that narrated the history of Rome, became the stage for a silent struggle against hunger and cold. There were no armed guards at every door, but surveillance was total, and the food supply was rationed to the limit of survival. This phase, which lasted months, was a decisive moment of purifying fire, not of spectacular miracles, but of human perseverance. While their stomachs rumbled and their bodies weakened, the sisters' souls grew stronger. They spent the long, cold days and nights in voluntary prayer and fasting, transforming imposed deprivation into heroic asceticism. Bibiana and Demetria were not simply waiting for death. They were actively choosing eternal life, exchanging the comforts that had been snatched from them for the treasure of their faith. It was an invisible yet concrete spiritual work, a foundation of rock that Roman terror would not be able to erode. Apronianus, impatient with the passive resistance, ordered the young women to be brought before him. He expected to find skeletal, desperate figures, ready to accept any offer of salvation in exchange for a simple word of denial. But when he saw them, he was confronted with a serenity that hunger could not erase. Then came Demetria's moment. In that dramatic instant, before the governor's demand that they renounce Christ, Demetria stepped forward. Her voice, possibly weak from malnutrition but unshakable in purpose, echoed in the tribunal. She confessed the faith of her family, the faith of her mother and father, and her own faith, and there, at the center stage of tyranny, before Apronianus could even give an order for torture, Demetria collapsed. The scene must have been one of terrifying silence. Demetria was not touched by a blade or a whip. She fell dead at the governor's feet. Many present, both Christians and pagans, considered this a prodigy of divine grace. It was as if God had immediately accepted her testimony of faith, removing her from the arena of suffering before physical violence could profane her. Demetria's body, freed by confession, was the first sign that Apronianus's plan would fail. For Bibiana, however, the ordeal had not ended. It had only intensified with solitude. The governor, frustrated by Demetria's unexpected death, changed tactics. He realized that physical torture would only produce more martyrs. His new goal was moral corruption, the stain. Bibiana was then handed over to a woman named Rufina, known to be a madam in Rome, whose mission was clear: to break the young woman's purity, force her into a pagan marriage, or, at worst for Bibiana, publicly demoralize her, destroying her testimony of chastity and faith. Bibiana's challenge in Rufina's house was, perhaps, the most subtle and psychologically exhausting of all. It was not just the pain of hunger, but the constant temptation. Rufina's house, in contrast to the hunger cell, may have been a place of sensory excesses: loud laughter, the sickly sweet smell of wine and cheap perfumes, constant pagan music. Rufina used every method at her disposal, from promises of wealth and comfort to threats and humiliations. She tried to convince Bibiana that life was short and that beauty and youth should be enjoyed. She appealed to human weaknesses, to the needs that every young person feels. But Bibiana, now hardened by fasting and the example of her loved ones, remained unshakable. Her strength lay in the deep certainty of her identity. She did not discuss theology with Rufina. She lived her faith, rejecting the lifestyle imposed on her. Her chastity was not just a virtue, it was a shield of integrity, a mirror reflecting Rufina's depravity. All attempts to corrupt her failed miserably. It was proof that faith was not just an intellectual belief, but a practical force that made the believer immune to the temptations of the world. Upon receiving the news of Rufina's total failure, Apronianus exploded in a savage fury. The governor realized that Bibiana could be broken neither by the pain of hunger nor by the pleasure of temptation. Only one option remained: physical extinction to silence the voice of faith. Bibiana was taken to a location outside the city walls. She was tied to a column, a symbol of stability and martyrdom. The chosen method was scourging with lead-tipped whips, tools designed to cause extreme pain and deep lacerations that ensured a slow, agonizing death. The sound of the scourging must have mingled with the silence of the crowd, a guttural, dry sound, with every blow of the lead against the virgin's skin. That was the climax of the drama. But as the blood flowed and the pain became unbearable, Bibiana kept her promise. There was no cry of denial, no plea for mercy that involved the betrayal of her Lord. Her voice, if it manifested at all, was only in prayer. What remained was the image of heroic perseverance, the proof that the human spirit, strengthened by faith, can transcend physical pain. She endured the ordeal to the end, dying tied to the column, consecrating herself as a martyr. In his final cruelty, Apronianus ordered Bibiana's body to be abandoned. The intention was to profane it, preventing Christians from collecting and venerating it. It was an attempt to erase the saint's memory, leaving her as fodder for the stray dogs that roamed the outskirts of Rome. But here the second undeniable prodigy occurred, the sign that creation itself recognized her sanctity. The dogs, typically hungry and fierce against human remains, simply refused to touch Bibiana's body. The martyr's body remained untouched, lying under the cold light of the Roman sun for 2 days, a beacon of purity in the midst of imperial savagery. This silence of the animals allowed the priest John, a man of discreet courage, to approach and rescue the martyr's body. He buried her honorably next to the tombs of her parents and sister. Saint Bibiana's legacy, however, did not stop there. The place of her martyrdom became a focus of devotion. The column to which she was tied, preserved in the basilica erected in her honor, itself became a vehicle for prodigies. Popular tradition attributes to her intercession the cure of particularly difficult ailments to understand in antiquity, such as chronic headaches, mental disorders, and epilepsy, ills that broke the body and spirit. This connection between her terrible pain in the head and her unchangeable testimony echoes for modern faithful who struggle against the invisible pressures of the mind and soul. Saint Bibiana did not just endure the persecution of a cruel emperor. She endured hunger, solitude, seduction, and physical pain. And her life is a powerful reminder that true sanctity is less about the grandiosity of miracles and more about the unbreakable integrity of character, a silent perseverance against all adversity. She remains, for modernity, as the silent patroness of resilience in a world that constantly tries to corrupt or weaken the human spirit. Her story invites us to ask, what are we willing to sacrifice today to preserve the integrity of our own faith and truth? The Roman sun of that winter of 363 AD seemed to have lost its warmth. In the city that had seen so many sacrifices, the atmosphere was heavy with fear, and the acrid smell of charcoal burning in the forges and the accumulated filth in the alleys. Bibiana, the last of her family to remain firm, had exhausted Governor Apronianus's patience. All methods failed. The rigorous house arrest, the hunger, the brutal loss of family, and now the vile attempt at moral corruption through the matron Rufina. Bibiana's beauty and chastity were not just physical attributes, they were symbols of her spiritual resistance. She was living proof that imperial terror had limits, that there was a territory within the human spirit that neither the confiscation of goods nor the threat of death could reach. For Apronianus, the failure to break her was a personal affront, a stain on his relentless authority. When Bibiana was brought for the last time before the makeshift tribunal, her steps were slow but firm. The long period of fasting and deprivation had made her skin pale and taut, but her eyes maintained an intense light of someone who had already glimpsed something beyond earthly misery. She did not wear the luxurious clothes of her noble youth. She wore simple, rustic rags, which emphasized her physical fragility and, ironically, her gigantic inner strength. Apronianus was seated, surrounded by his officers, all wrapped in heavy togas to protect themselves from the damp cold rising from the Tiber. The air in the room smelled of cheap incense, used to try to purify the environment after the passage of other defendants, and the cold sweat of fear. He did not bother to make long speeches. His voice, normally grave and authoritative, now sounded clipped with anger. He offered Bibiana the last chance, the ritualistic formula of denying Christ, offering a grain of incense to the gods of the empire, and returning to life, perhaps even with some social benefit in exchange for her future silence. Bibiana responded with a voice that was barely a whisper, but which reverberated on the cold stone of the praetorium with the force of thunder. Her faith was non-negotiable. She had already seen the price of eternity paid by her father Flavian, her mother Daphrosa, and her beloved sister Demetria. Now it was her turn to receive the crown. Apronianus's fury exploded. That calm, unshakable defiance was more dangerous to the stability of the empire than any barbarian army. If a young woman, alone and helpless, could defy Rome's authority and win, then Christianity was, in fact, an existential threat. He delivered the final sentence, a cruel sentence designed to extract not only life, but also maximum physical suffering. She would be tied up and scourged to death. The place chosen for the execution was probably an outer courtyard open to the city's grey sky. She was led by the lictors, men with impassive faces and robust bodies, accustomed to dehumanizing their victims. There, a stone column awaited her, cold and hard, a silent landmark that would be her final altar. The soldiers forced her arms back and tied her to the column. The rough texture of the stone brushed against her thin skin. The silence that settled was not of respect, but of brutal anticipation. One could only hear the dry sound of the wind beating against the leafless trees, and more menacingly, the clinking of the execution instruments. The executioners, muscular men devoid of mercy, wielded the whips, the flagrum, made of leather strips that had small lead fragments, the plumbate, at the tips. These whips were not only meant to cause pain, they were designed to lacerate the flesh and crush the bones. Bibiana closed her eyes, not to surrender to dread, but to concentrate her soul. In that moment of sensory horror, the metallic smell of the executioner's sweat, the roughness of the ropes, the imminence of excruciating pain, she clung to the prayers her mother had taught her. She envisioned the light, the promise of a family reunion that was only a breath away. The first blow tore the air with a sharp hiss. It was followed by the wet, dull sound of the lead hitting the skin. A cry escaped from the watching crowd, but from Bibiana, only a stifled gasp. The sound of the scourging, repeated, rhythmic and relentless, became the only sound in her universe. Each blow was a wave of pain that threatened to drag her into unconsciousness, but she resisted, sustained by a strength that was no longer hers, but of divine grace. Reaching 80 or 90 blows of the plumbata was enough to kill the strongest man. For the young Bibiana, the martyrdom was quick in its cruelty. With each lash, her flesh came undone, her physical strength diminished, but her refusal to blaspheme or yield remained. Blood splattered on the cold stone, creating a scarlet pattern that was, for the hidden Christians, the most eloquent of confessions of faith. Finally, with a blow that broke her body and emptied her breath, the sound of the scourging ceased. The executioners retreated, tired of their task, but perhaps strangely disturbed by the victim's quiet determination. The martyr virgin's body, now bloodied and disfigured, hung lifeless, tied to the column. Saint Bibiana had given her final testimony, the ultimate sacrifice of earthly life for celestial glory. Apronianus's revenge, however, did not end with death. Bibiana's body was untied and thrown into the street, exposed, a gesture of contempt to prevent Christians from honoring her relics and thus nullifying her power as a martyr. The dogs, wild and hungry, that roamed the outskirts of Rome, were summoned. expected to tear the body apart, erasing any trace of her existence. But a new sign manifested itself in the darkness. The dogs arrived with their hoarse barks and hungry gazes and surrounded the abandoned body. They smelled the air, the metallic odor of blood, the exposed flesh, but inexplicably they did not touch her. They remained at a distance, howling at the sky or simply silent, as if an invisible barrier, an incorruptible sanctity, prevented them from profaning the body that had been the temple of fidelity to Christ. This silent miracle was the proof that the believers needed. During the night, under the protection of the dark veil and risking his own life, a priest named John, one of the few Christian leaders remaining in the area, cautiously approached. He found Bibiana's body intact, a sight that, amidst the horror, brought strange and deep peace. With great reverence and the help of some faithful, John collected the martyr's precious body. He wrapped it in clean linen and took it for burial, not far from the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. There, in the sacred catacombs, Bibiana was reunited in final rest with her parents, Flavian and Defrosa, and her sister Demetria. Bibiana's death, around 363 AD, marked the physical end of a family, but the beginning of a powerful cult. She was not just another victim of imperial cruelty. She became the symbol of absolute perseverance, the young woman who endured pain, temptation, and isolation without ever doubting. Her column of martyrdom, which would later be venerated on the site, became the focal point of pilgrimage. Her story resonated through the centuries, especially in moments of crisis and doubt. In a world where integrity is frequently attacked and where mental and emotional pressures crush us, Saint Bibiana, the saint of perseverance, offers a timeless testimony. She reminds us that even when we are tied to our own columns of suffering, be they diseases, losses, or attacks on our faith, true freedom lies in the unshakable resolution to keep the soul whole, looking forward to the reward that awaits those who do not bend. The basilica erected in her honor, restored and embellished by masters like Bernini, remains in Rome today, a stone beacon that shouts the truth of her life. Faith, when forged in pain, is unbreakable. Saint Bibiana's death was not a period in her story, but the explosion of a new and powerful beacon in the spiritual landscape of 4th century Rome. Governor Apronianus, in his final arrogance, believed that by abandoning the young virgin's body to the dogs, he would extinguish not only her life, but also her memory. He wished to prevent that suffering from becoming a relic, a sign of triumph for the Christians. However, on a cold, damp night under the heavy cloak of the Roman sky, a supernatural silence descended upon the place. The dogs, usually voracious and attracted by the smell of fresh blood, kept their distance in an invisible fence of respect, leaving the martyr's body untouched, a silent proof of a dignity that even brutal death could not destroy. This manifestation of reverence, whether understood as a theological miracle or as a notable anomaly observed by witnesses, ensured that Bibiana's body was recovered. The priest John, a man of silent courage who risked his own life under the threat of persecution, devoutly collected the young woman's remains. Bibiana's body was honorably buried in the cemetery near the Via Ostiense, alongside her parents, Flavian and Defrosa, and her sister, Demetria. Thus, the family that had been dismembered by the cruelty of the state was reunited in the peace of the sacred ground. This act of burial, simple and risky, was the first step toward Bibiana's popular and later official canonization. Canonization, in the context of the 4th century, did not follow the formal and complex process we know today. It was an organic and immediate recognition of sanctity. A martyr who gave her life for Christ was automatically considered a hero of faith and an intercessor. Bibiana's blood, shed in 363, acted as the seed of which Tertullian had spoken centuries before. With the end of the imperial persecutions and the rise of Christianity under Constantine and later Theodosius, the memory of the martyrs transformed into institutionalized veneration. The unbreakable faith of Bibiana's family demanded a place of honor. As early as the 5th century, devotion to Bibiana was so consolidated that a basilica was erected at the traditional site of her martyrdom, on the Esquiline Hill, the exact spot where the young woman had drawn her last breath. The Basilica of Santa Bibiana is the materialization of her legacy. It traversed the Middle Ages, witnessed the turbulence of the Renaissance, but it was in the 17th century, at the height of Baroque splendor, that her memory was grandiosely revitalized. Pope Urban VIII, in 1624, commissioned none other than Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the supreme master of Baroque art, to restore the church and create a statue to honor the martyr. Bernini, with his unparalleled ability to capture drama and emotion in marble, sculpted the image of Saint Bibiana standing beside the column where she was scourged. Contemplating the sculpture, we are transported to that moment of anguish and glory. Bernini captured not the physical pain of the scourging, but the inner dignity. Her eyes are turned toward heaven in ecstasy. Her hand is gently touching the column that became her altar of sacrifice. The statue serves as a powerful visual reminder that faith, when taken to the extreme, transforms torture into triumph. It is in this sanctuary, which holds the relics of Bibiana and her beloved Afrosa and Demetria, that popular devotion solidified the saint's specific intercessions. The Roman people, who witnessed her integrity and her terrible end, began to invoke her against ailments that afflicted both the mind and the body. Saint Bibiana became the patroness against headaches, epilepsy, and mental illnesses. This association is not accidental. The flagellation with lead, the method of her execution, was designed to cause excruciating trauma to the head and nervous system. The leaden whips, heavy and inflexible, struck the body and face with devastating force, resulting in concussions and piercing pain. Thus, the belief that she, who endured such physical violence to the head and spirit, could intercede for those suffering from inexplicable pain and mental torments, took deep root in the popular imagination. This is the balance between miracle and reality. Sanctity sprouts from real human suffering, transformed by divine grace. Bibiana, the saint of perseverance, continues to speak to us, who live 17 centuries later. Although most of us do not face the imminent danger of lead-tipped whips or the imperial guillotine, we live in an era of subtle yet equally corrosive persecution. We face the persecution of chronic stress, suffocating anxiety, and the constant pressure to mold our values to the fleeting dictates of culture. Her story is a mirror for our internal conflicts. Bibiana's humanity resides in her choice, which must have been heavy and agonizing. Let us imagine the young woman alone after seeing her father die in exile, her mother beheaded, and her sister fall dead at her feet. The smell of mourning and despair must have lingered over that house. The temptation to simply yield, marry, and live a life of comfort would have been immense. Apronianus's persecution, by handing her over to Rufina for her morals to be corrupted, reveals the cruelest strategy, not just to kill the body, but to destroy the soul, forcing her to renounce her integrity. Bibiana's perseverance is the art of saying no, no to conformity, no to corruption, no to fear. In a world where moral clarity is often obscured and authenticity is punished, the Martyr Virgin teaches us that true resistance begins in the silent trench of the heart. She reminds us that integrity is not something to be sold or negotiated. It is the hard core of our humanity. The Basilica, Bernini's marble, the flowers that devotees leave on her feast day, December 2nd, are more than mere rituals. They are tactile reminders that genuine faith demands sacrifice and often solitude. Saint Bibiana's legacy lies not only in the miracles she may perform on behalf of the sick, but in the simple and profound message that it is worth keeping the flame lit. If today we feel overwhelmed by the pressures of modern life, exhausted by the incessant attempt to balance what is right with what is easy, we can turn to the column on the Esquiline. There, we find the testimony of a young woman who exchanged earthly safety for eternity, proving that courage, in the end, is not the absence of fear, but the unshakable decision to remain faithful to what one knows to be true. Saint Bibiana is not just a martyr of the past. She is the patroness of resilience in the present, a beacon of faith that calls us to our own necessary perseverance. May her example inspire us to resist the small and great tyrannies of our time, maintaining, like her, our eyes fixed on the non-negotiable dignity of the soul. Prayer, O glorious Saint Bibiana, Virgin and Martyr, who by the purity of your soul and unshakable faith became a mirror of constancy amidst the world's tempest, we lift our eyes and hearts to you in this valley of tears. In your youth, you preferred the imperishable crown of celestial glory to the fleeting seductions of the earth, and with admirable fortitude, you endured martyrdom without wavering, bearing witness with your blood to fidelity to Christ, the Redeemer. Intercede for us, O beloved patroness, before the throne of divine majesty. Pray to the Lord that he may grant us the grace to imitate your integrity and your firmness in trials, so that we may never lose sight of the hope that awaits us. Protect us from all evil, physical and spiritual. Purify our thoughts and strengthen our will, so that we may live in conformity with the precepts of the gospel. Especially we ask you, mention intention, if it is God's will for our salvation. May we, through your powerful intercession, Saint Bibiana, be worthy of attaining final perseverance and one day praise you in the eternal beatitude of paradise. Amen. My prayer. O Lord our God, in elevated gratitude, we lift our hearts to thank you for the gift of life and the privilege of carrying forward your love through the stories that inspire and transform us. We thank you, Father, for granting us the strength, wisdom, and courage to share the teachings of your gospel through this channel, which has been a beacon of hope and light amidst the adversities of the world. Lord, we recognize that every life is a precious gift, and we are grateful for every moment granted to us to witness and propagate your word. May every story told, every message of faith, and every divine teaching reach hearts thirsty for love, truth, and reconciliation. We thank you for the inspiration that guides us, for the blessings that multiply, and for the opportunity to contribute to the dissemination of Christianity, bringing the light of your love to those who seek direction and comfort. May your grace continue to illuminate us, and may we be instruments of your mercy and compassion, reflecting the beauty of your love in every word and gesture. In the name of Jesus, our Savior, we thank you for allowing us to participate in this sacred mission. Amen. We have just witnessed a life marked by the iron of persecution, but also by the unbreakable strength of faith. Saint Bibiana's story is not just an ancient record. It is a mirror that does not reflect the absence of pain, but the unshakable presence of hope, even when we feel alone in the darkness. She teaches us that true courage is not fighting against others, but keeping our inner light burning, whatever the cost. If this journey of faith and resilience touched your soul and inspired you to steady your step, we invite you to walk with us. Our mission is to continue bringing these stories of light and truth so that they may never be forgotten. To be part of this community, it is simple. Subscribe to the channel right now. By subscribing, you help us give voice to those who dedicated their lives to the truth. Leave your like if you feel that Bibiana's message needs to reach more hearts. And finally, if you know someone who is going through a time of great trial, someone who urgently needs a beacon of hope, share this video. Help us extend the hand of faith. And to continue our reflection, After hearing the price Bibiana paid for her truth, I ask you, on your path of faith, what is the value you struggle most to keep intact, even when everything tries to make you yield? Leave your honest answer in the comments. To delve even deeper into this universe of strength and spirituality, click on one of the videos that appears above, chosen especially for you. Until the next story, may God bless your journey